What happens when a successful woman meets a homeless man on the street? In a single moment of kindness, their lives change forever, revealing the unexpected power of compassion, second chances, and the true meaning of wealth. This heartwarming story will remind you that the most valuable treasures in life are the ones we can't buy. The city street was alive with the usual mid-afternoon hustle, horns honking, people rushing by in every direction, and the unmistakable hum of traffic. It was the kind of noise Sophia had become numb to, yet today it felt louder than ever. She glanced at her watch, feeling the anxiety building in her chest. Her important meeting with a potential client was just minutes away, and she was already running late. She adjusted her high-end business suit and struggled to juggle her large, overstuffed handbag, a cup of coffee and her phone, all while trying to navigate the crowded sidewalk. Sophia, in her early 40s, was used to the fast pace of her high-powered career. Her days were a blur of meetings, negotiations, and deadlines, but today, things weren't going as smoothly. The strap of her handbag kept slipping off her shoulder, and her phone kept vibrating with texts she couldn't afford to answer. As she tried to steady everything, she took a step forward, and that's when it happened. Her phone slipped from her hand and hit the pavement with a sharp crack. The screen cracked in an instant, sending a wave of frustration through her. She bent down to retrieve it, but before she could fully bend over, a hand appeared in her line of sight, reaching out with surprising swiftness. Startled, Sophia looked up, her heart racing. A man stood in front of her, dressed in ragged clothes, his face weathered by years of hardship. His hair was graying, and his eyes, though tired, held a quiet warmth. He wore the look of someone who had seen far too much of life's darker side, but still managed to carry an air of calm dignity. Elliot, a black man in his mid-50s, had been sitting on a nearby bench, observing the world go by with an alertness that seemed rare in a city like this. Despite his situation, there was something undeniably kind about the way he looked at her. "Here you go," he said gently, handing her the phone with a smile that softened the hard edges of her frustration. "Careful there." Sophia hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to say or how to react. She hadn't expected help from someone like him, and she wasn't sure if it was out of kindness or obligation. But in that brief, quiet moment, she felt a flicker of gratitude. "Thank you," she finally said, her voice softer than usual. Sophia took the phone from Elliot, her fingers brushing against his for just a moment. The touch was brief, yet something about it lingered, pulling her out of her hectic thoughts. She looked up at him and offered a quick, slightly embarrassed smile. His warm expression immediately eased some of the tension she didn't realize she had been holding. It was rare for her to find kindness in the midst of her chaotic life, and even rarer for it to come from someone she would never expect. Someone like Elliot. "Thank you," she said again, her voice steadier now. She couldn't help but notice how calm he was, despite his worn clothes and the way his shoulders slumped with the weight of life. There was no rush, no sense of urgency in him. He was simply present. Elliot smiled in return, his eyes crinkling at the edges. "No problem," he said with a light chuckle. "Street's tough sometimes. People are always in a hurry, running into each other." His tone was easy, almost as if he were speaking to an old friend rather than a stranger. Sophia blinked, caught off guard by the simplicity of his words. She glanced around at the busy street and realized how true it was. Everyone seemed to be rushing from one place to another, lost in their own worlds. She took a deep breath and tried to push aside the stress that had been mounting in her chest all day. Elliot's voice broke her out of her thoughts once again. "Looks like you've got a lot to carry there," he said, nodding toward the heavy bag hanging off her shoulder. "Mind if I help?" Sophia paused. The offer seemed generous, but she wasn't sure. She wasn't used to accepting help from anyone, let alone a stranger, especially one whose life seemed so far removed from hers. But then, with a quick glance at her watch, she realized how late she truly was. The stress of the meeting loomed large, and the weight of her bag was suddenly unbearable. "All right," she said, with a sigh of reluctant acceptance. "I could use a little help." Elliot took her bag without hesitation, and they began walking together, the brief silence between them filled only by the distant noise of the city. As they moved forward, Sophia found herself opening up, speaking more freely than she'd intended. "I'm heading to a meeting," she said, her voice softening. "Big one. It's a huge deal for me. So much is riding on it." Elliot nodded, walking beside her with an understanding that seemed to reach deeper than words. "Sounds stressful," he said gently, "but it'll work out." Sophia's eyes flickered to him, surprised by his confidence. For a moment she forgot about her meeting, her mind easing into the rhythm of the walk and the unexpected calm of the conversation. As they walked down the sidewalk, the noise of the city began to fade, replaced by the steady rhythm of their footsteps. Sophia found herself unexpectedly at ease, the weight of her meeting momentarily forgotten. Elliot, carrying her bag with an easy, natural grace, seemed in no hurry. His pace matched hers, slow and steady, as if he didn't mind the journey, no matter how long it took. They walked in comfortable silence for a while before Elliot spoke again, his voice steady but tinged with a quiet sadness. "I wasn't always like this, you know," he said, glancing at her. "Used to have a job, a home, a family." Sophia turned her head to look at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his words. She'd never expected him to open up so quickly, but there was something about him that felt safe, like he wasn't afraid to share his story with her. "I was working construction," Elliot continued, his eyes briefly clouding with a memory. "Had a good job. But one day, an accident happened. I got hurt, pretty bad. Broke my leg, couldn't work anymore. After a while, everything just fell apart. Lost my job, lost my apartment, and here I am." He gave a small shrug, as if it was just another chapter in his life, no more important than the weather. Sophia felt her chest tighten, not out of pity, but out of a deep sense of empathy. She could hear the resilience in his voice, the way he had accepted his circumstances without bitterness. He wasn't asking for sympathy. He was simply telling her his truth. As they continued walking, Sophia found herself reflecting on her own struggles. Her heart had been weighed down by the stress of her career, her constant need to prove herself in a world that seemed to demand more and more. But now, hearing Elliot's story, she felt a sharp contrast between her complaints and his resilience. In comparison to the hardships he had faced, her struggles seemed almost trivial. She'd been stressed about a meeting, worried about a contract, but nothing she had dealt with even came close to the depth of Elliot's experience. And yet, despite everything, he carried himself with such grace, offering kindness to a complete stranger without a second thought. It hit her then. Elliot's strength wasn't in how he had survived, but in how he had remained kind, unbroken by the world around him. That was a power she hadn't fully understood until now. She was beginning to realize that true wealth wasn't in material things or professional success, but in the ability to endure hardship with a generous heart. As they continued to walk, Sophia's mind was racing, processing everything Elliot had shared. The deep kindness he exuded in the face of such hardship was something she couldn't shake. She found herself wanting to do something, anything, to show him that his story had touched her. Something more than just the brief interaction they'd shared. They passed a cozy cafe, its windows fogged with the warmth inside, and Sophia suddenly stopped. "Would you like to grab a bite to eat?" she asked, her voice tentative but sincere. Elliot looked at her, surprised by the offer, and for a moment he seemed unsure. I don't want to put you out," he said, his voice soft, as if he weren't accustomed to such kindness. Sophia smiled, shaking her head. "It's no trouble. You've already helped me today. Let me return the favor." After a brief moment of hesitation, Elliot nodded, and together they stepped inside the cafe. They sat at a small corner table, the quiet hum of conversation around them as they shared a simple meal. As they ate, their conversation continued. Elliot spoke more about his life, how he had once been a successful construction manager, married with children, living a life that seemed secure. But everything had changed after the accident. He had lost his job, his family, and the stability he had worked so hard to build. Yet, despite everything, he never lost his sense of hope. Sophia listened intently, moved by the depth of his resilience. It wasn't just the pain he had endured that struck her. It was how he had managed to hold on to his faith in people, his belief in kindness, even when the world had seemed to turn its back on him. By the time they finished their meal, Sophia felt a new sense of purpose. Elliot deserved more than just a kind gesture. He deserved a chance to rebuild, to reclaim the life he had lost. Inspired by his story, she decided to take action. That afternoon, she reached out to a local charity she had supported for years, one that offered job training and housing for people in need. A few days later, she arranged for Elliot to meet with their team. It wasn't much, but it was a fresh start, an opportunity for him to rebuild. Sophia knew that, like the rest of his life, the road ahead would not be easy. But she also knew that Elliot was the kind of person who would rise again, and in some way she hoped she could be part of that rise. A few months later, Sophia found herself at a charity gala, mingling with donors and community leaders as she often did. The event was for a cause close to her heart, one she had supported for years, but tonight, it felt different. As she entered the hall, she noticed a familiar face among the crowd. Elliot. He was standing at the podium, dressed in a neat suit, his once weathered appearance now transformed into someone who radiated purpose and dignity. Elliot caught her gaze from across the room and smiled, his eyes lighting up with a warmth that could only come from someone who had found a renewed sense of hope. After finishing his speech as the community ambassador, he made his way toward her, his expression a mixture of gratitude and emotion. "Sophia," he said, his voice filled with appreciation. "I never thought I'd be standing here like this, speaking in front of so many people. But everything changed when you gave me that chance." Sophia felt a lump form in her throat. She had known this moment would come, but seeing Elliot in front of her, not as the man she had met on the street, but as someone whose life had truly turned around, was overwhelming. "It's you who changed your own life," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "I just gave you a little nudge. You did all the work." Elliot smiled again, his voice growing stronger as he turned to the room. "I want to thank you, Sophia, for showing me that kindness can make all the difference. I didn't think people like me could get another shot, but you showed me that we all deserve a second chance." As he spoke, Sophia realized that his gratitude wasn't just about the help he had received, it was about the shared humanity that had brought them together. She felt a deep warmth in her chest, realizing how much this journey had transformed her as well. Walking home that evening, she reflected on how unexpected acts of kindness had the power to change both the giver and the receiver. In a world often consumed by wealth and success, she had come to understand that true wealth was not measured by money, but by the impact we have on others. The connections we make, the kindness we share, and the lives we touch, these were the things that truly mattered. Sophia knew, without a doubt, that her life had been richer because of Elliot, and she was forever grateful for the lesson he had unknowingly taught her.